that time again. It's been one whole year since I last dove into my yarn stash in the form of data and broke it all up according to what kind of yarn I bought, when I bought it, where I bought it, what fibre it's made of, what colour, and importantly, just exactly how much I had bought in my first year of knitting and then how much I'd used up. And I used that information to figure out how many years of knitting I have left from my stash. The numbers were a bit frightening. You can go watch that video. And I thought, since it's been another year, it's maybe time to compare them and see how much progress I've made this year compared to last year. And I've crunched all the numbers and I'm really excited to share these charts with you. I'm working off my laptop here. I'll put the charts up on the screen so you guys can see them. So for starters, the big question is, has my stash gotten any bigger during my no buy, low buy year and my stash down? Last year, my stash in grams weighed 16,909. And I am very happy to report that this year, my stash weighs 15,899 grams, which means I have technically stashed down in 2025. Very exciting. And more excitingly, I've actually used up quite a bit of yarn. So last year, in my first year of knitting, I used up 4,438 meters of yarn. This year, I used up 5,366 meters. So I have actually increased my knitting speed by about 21%, or my knitting volume. And that's really exciting because that dramatically reduces the amount of time it will take me to knit through my collection. So despite using up so much more this year, you'll notice my stash did not go down by that much. And that's because I did actually buy some yarn. This year I bought 3,089 grams of yarn, and that's 9,192 meters. That was part of the plan. So I committed to a no-buy challenge at the beginning of 2025, and I bought very little yarn throughout the year. However, I did have a trip overseas in November and I had decided that I wanted to spend my money then and buy some yarn there. So that is exactly what I did. If we look at my purchases by month, we can see that I bought a small amount of yarn in January, June, and September. And then I bought most of the yarn for the year in November at 2,050 grams. I fit all of that in my suitcase and that was a real tight squeeze. And then I bought 200 grams in December. So how I've organized this chart is the brightly colored bars are this most recent year and the sort of faded bars are last year's numbers. So you can compare month to month. So in my first year of knitting, I bought a lot of yarn in January, which was just out of excitement and not having a yarn stash. But you can see that every month I was buying a reasonable amount of yarn, like more than a kilo most months. So I'm really pleased with my progress in managing to actually commit to a no-buy most months of the year. I think 6 or 7 of these months I didn't buy any yarn. And I am really happy with all the yarn that I bought while I was overseas. So I definitely think it was worth it. And I'm proud of myself for spending the year using up my stash to make room for that new yarn. And it feels really good to come out with a net reduction in my yarn stash at the end of the day. So if we go back to my overall stats, you can see that I did trade, sell, gift a little bit of yarn this year, nowhere near as much as last year. So that also helped contribute to the reduction in my stash. In my first year, I bought most of my yarn secondhand. This was a great way to build up my stash without spending heaps of money. However, this year I wanted to be really, really deliberate in the kind of yarn that I bought. And as well as going overseas, I was checking out all these yarn stores. So I did decide to buy most of my yarn brand new this year. So this pie chart here shows just how much of my overall stash now has been bought new, which is 78.5 skeins versus secondhand, which is 338 skeins. So it's about a 19% to 81% split. And that's really different from last year. Last year, I only had bought 9 skeins new total. So it was 98% secondhand. I'm still really happy with this ratio. I think over time, the number of skeins that have been bought new will probably continue to increase as I slowly collect yarn kind of intentionally. And last time I did this data breakdown, I was surprised to learn that Saturdays were my big spending days. So I'm really happy to see that this year my yarn purchases were a lot more even across the week, and actually no purchases on Sundays, which is interesting. My biggest day of the week was Wednesdays. I'm not exactly sure why that is. I can't think of anything special I do on Wednesdays. It's probably just during my trip. So there's a couple different ways we can break down my stash. First one I want to do is by care instructions. So that's whether or not something is hand wash or machine wash. This is a bit of a proxy measurement as you can't export this information fully out of Ravelry, but you can get a sense of it by looking on Ravelry at the filters section. The saturated blue bars here represent my stash as it is now, and the faded blue bars represent my stash as it was a year ago. I have about 58 lots of yarn that are hand wash only and 32 that are machine wash. It's really not a huge difference from last year in terms of the ratio of hand wash to machine wash overall. In the breakdown by fiber type, I can see that I have used up quite a lot of my mohair and my silk yarns, which I definitely feel like was due to using some of my nicer yarns out of my stash that have a bit more of a mixed fiber blend. But otherwise, the split is relatively similar as it was last year, with wool being my number one favorite fiber type. And interestingly, if you break down my stash by whether or not I have roughly a sweater's quantity of one yarn in one color, I've actually got more sweater quantities in my stash now than I did a year ago. That's probably from me buying things new, where I can get as much of one color as I want, rather than buying things secondhand, where I'm often forced to get more than one color and mix and match to make a garment. Now, I couldn't figure out a good way to get this color breakdown onto one graph for both years, so we'll just have to flick between the two, but it's very similar this year as to what it was last year, honestly. The only thing, my collection of blue yarn has increased, which makes sense because that's one of my favorite colors. If we take a look at the stash breakdown by weight, meaning the thickness of the yarn, again, it's very similar to last year. I haven't really changed anything massively, although you'll note that I have worked through my super bulky category, and that was in my striped slippers experiments. As it was last year, my biggest category by weight is DK weight yarn. But what that doesn't account for is that the lighter weights of yarn have more meterage and thus take a little bit longer to knit. So if we look at this breakdown by meterage instead, then you can see that fingering weight yarn is actually my biggest category. So aside from my stash mostly looking pretty similar in terms of its makeup this year, what I was most excited to find out, of course, was did my increase in knitting velocity and my reduction in yarn purchases make really any difference in my collecting habit? So first, let's look at the years of knitting I have left at my current rate. Noting the rate of knitting has increased by 21% this year, and my stash has gone down just a little bit in size. It's really exciting to see that means that if we go by meterage, I'd actually be done with my stash in a little over 9 years. That is compared to last year, where it was looking like it would take me almost 11 years to knit through. So it's been a year since then, so if we take 11 down to 10, I've managed to reduce the amount of time it would take me to knit through all my yarn by meter by about 10%. However, if we actually look at this from a weight perspective, because I managed to get through so much of that super bulky yarn this year, it means that my kind of usage of grams of yarn has gone way, way, way up. And so it's skewed this result a little bit, but if I continue working through my yarn at the rate of grams that I did this year, I will be finished with my stash in less than 3.5 years, which is a huge improvement. Last year, it was looking like it would take me about 8 years to get through it all. So that's probably not very realistic because I don't have any super bulky yarn anymore, and that's what made that number so drastic. Since this year, I used up 4,734 grams of yarn, and last year I only used up 2,091 grams of yarn, even though the meterage I used up was really, really similar. So I used 21% more meterage, but almost double the weight. So you can see why I don't love using grams as a measure of knitting speed, because it can be so easily affected by things like yarn weight. But it actually does go to show that if you're someone who enjoys knitting heavier weights of yarn, you're going to be able to work through like hefty amounts of yarn a lot faster than someone who works predominantly with lace or fingering weight. So with my new yarn acquisition rate being so much lower than it was last year, I was curious to see what effect that would have if I didn't stop buying yarn and I kept buying it at the rate I did this year, which I felt was a pretty sustainable rate. When I looked at the data last year, it would only have been about 4 years until I would have collected so much yarn that I couldn't possibly have used it in the rest of my life, no matter how hard I tried. This year, I'm very excited to report that that number has been pushed out to about 19 years. So if I kept buying at the rate I have been and knitting at the rate I have been, it would take about 19 years until I get to a point where I have an equal amount of years left of knitting as I do years left in my yarn stash. So that is so great. It's such an improvement and really just a lot more realistic. I'm never going to get up to these crazy amounts of yarn. Even if I kept buying yarn for the rest of my life and I didn't stop when I hit stash acquisition beyond life expectancy, then I would only end up with a very reasonable 99.96 years worth of yarn at the end of my life. So that is compared to last year when I would have gotten myself to about 616 years worth of yarn by continuing to acquire at the same rate I had been. So I've reduced that amount by 6-fold, which is huge. So yeah, that's all the stash data I've looked into for the time being. I know a lot of you guys had some really great ideas about different ways I could break up the data. For simplicity's sake, I decided to just really stick with what I did last year, so it was a little bit easier for me to reuse the formulas and charts, but also compare year to year. And I do hope to continue doing this going forward. I haven't yet decided what my plans are going to be for 2026 in terms of yarn buying and yarn usage. I'd definitely love to pick up the knitting pace a little bit more even this year. It's been quite a busy start to the year for me, so I haven't done as much as I would like. But I'll have a think about whether I'm going to do another no buy, low buy, whether I'm going to do some sort of stash down challenges, try to work through some of that bulkier weight yarn, and so on. I'll also do another physical stash update with you guys soon, where I can show you just how well it's all fitting into my bins, give you a little bit of a look at the different yarns I have, and of course share the yarn I bought overseas, which is so exciting. So I hope you enjoyed that breakdown. I hope you're proud of me for working through all that yarn and reducing the crazy amounts I was buying in my first year of knitting. I hope it's been helpful to you, and I would really like to hear about your yarn stash. If you told me some plans last year, let me know how you went with those. If it's your first time thinking about how your yarn collection might be represented in data, I really recommend it. If you use Ravelry, you can export all this information and play around in Excel or Google Sheets. But also there's probably a lot you could do by hand too. So anyway, thanks for watching guys. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you very soon. Happy knitting.